The first thing that was wrong, I noticed before the guard did, and I said nothing, which is a thing I will carry the rest of my working life. I am the clerk of works for the lantern wing of Warden Hall, and I have been for 19 years. That is a small title in a great house, and most days it means I count slates and chase the leak in the south gutter and write down what the masons did so that someone, somewhere, can be cross about the cost of it. But the title carries one duty that outranks all the counting. I keep the truth of the building. Every stone laid, every beam pinned, every repair made, it goes in my book, dated and signed, so that 100 years from now a man like me can open the page and know exactly what was done and why. The lantern wing is 600 years old. It is protected by an instrument older than any of us, a deed of preservation that says, in language nobody has bothered to read in a generation, that the wing may be maintained but never diminished. Maintained but never diminished. I had typed those words onto a dozen forms without once feeling their weight. Then the work order came across my desk on a Tuesday, and the weight arrived all at once. It was a routine thing on its face, stabilization of the East Range, approved, funded, signed by the surveyor of the fabric himself, Master Orrin Veck. I had no quarrel with Veck. He was courteous, precise, the sort of man who remembered your wife's name and the leak in your south gutter. But the order asked for the delivery of demolition shoring and a 40-yard skip line and the temporary removal of the deed plaques from the east colonnade for cleaning. And those three things, sitting together on one page, did not add up to a repair. You do not bring demolition shoring to hold a wall up. You bring it to hold a wall up while you take it down. I told myself I had misread it. I am good at telling myself things. The man who did not tell himself anything was the sentry at the lantern arch. His name was Trooper Cashin Brennick, Bree to the watch, though no one outside the watch would have dared, and he had stood that arch for 3 winters. He was the stillest man I ever saw, and I have seen old men sleep through cannon. He did not look at me when I passed under his arch that Tuesday with the work order rolled in my fist. He did not look at anything. But 2 days later, when the first lorry of shoring came through the service yard, and the foreman began to stack steel against the east wall, I watched Brennick's eyes move, just once, just a flick, down to the steel and back to the middle distance, and I knew that he had read the same page I had in his own way, and had come to the same place I was too much of a coward to go. Because that is the thing about the lantern arch. From it, the sentry sees the whole East Range. He sees the colonnade with its 6 carved capitals, each one a different beast, the hart, the wolf, the wren. He sees the oriel window the old kings are said to have prayed at. He sees the masons come and go. He has, for 3 winters, watched men maintain that range, and a man who watches a thing every day for 3 years knows the rhythm of caring for it. And what came off those lorries that week was not the rhythm of caring for it. I should explain who I was afraid of, and it was not Veck. Above Veck sat the controller of the household estates, a smiling, exhausted man named Pell Caro who had been brought in 2 years before to rationalize the portfolio, which is the kind of phrase that should make a clerk of works reach for his coat and run. Caro spoke of the lantern wing the way a butcher speaks of a field fondly, and in terms of yield. The East Range, he had told a committee I was not supposed to have minuted, sat on the most valuable frontage in the precinct. I had written it down because writing things down is the only courage I have ever reliably possessed. I had not done anything else with it. On the Thursday, the cleaning of the deed plaques began. They came with a van and soft cloths and a work order I had not seen, and they took down the bronze plaque from the east colonnade, the one that names the deed of preservation and its date, and they took down the one beside the oriel, and they wrapped them in baize and drove them away to the conservation studio. And I stood in my own yard and understood, with a coldness that started in my stomach, that you do not need to argue with a protection if you can simply make it disappear from the wall. A wing with no plaque is just a wing. A man arriving in a year, with a new committee and a short memory, would see only old stone and a valuable frontage and a tidy file that said stabilization. I went to the arch. I do not know why. Brennick could not help me, and a sentry is not a man you confide in. But I stood near him, pretending to inspect the gutter, and I said, low, not really to him, "They've taken the plaques." He did not move his head, but after a moment he said, and his voice was so quiet it might have been the wind in the arch, "I know. I logged it." I had not known a sentry kept a log. He didn't, not officially. But I learned later that every man on that arch kept a small disciplined record of what passed beneath it in the back of the post book, because the watch's first law is that nothing enters or leaves the king's house unobserved. Brennick had 3 winters of that range in the back of a book. He knew what had stood at the colonnade. He knew it was gone. And this is the part that undid me. He knew it had gone out under a work order, which meant it had gone out under my authority, with my signature somewhere in the chain. "It's a repair," I said. The lie tasted of tin. "No," said Brennick. He still had not looked at me. "A repair brings the right tools. I've watched them mend that range for 3 years. They never once brought a skip the length of the colonnade, a pause the length of a heartbeat, and they never took the names off the wall. I want to tell you I went straight to someone. I did not. I went home and did not sleep, and in the small hours I understood the shape of the thing entire. The stabilization was a demolition. The demolition would be reported as the regrettable but unavoidable consequence of decay discovered mid-works, old buildings, you understand. You open them up and find the rot. The cleared frontage would be quietly added to the precinct's developable land, the deed conveniently unplaqued and the file conveniently thin, and somewhere a valuation would rise by a number with a great many zeros, and Caro would be praised for rationalizing the portfolio. It was not even illegal, if you did it carefully. That was the genius of it. It was a robbery dressed as a repair, and the only man who had said the word aloud was a sentry who, by every rule of his service, was not permitted to say anything at all. By Friday morning the shoring was up. The first capital, the wren, was caged in steel. And under the arch, Trooper Brennick stood as he had stood for 3 winters, eyes forward, perfectly still. I did not yet understand that his stillness was not surrender. It was the longest, hardest stand I would ever watch a man make, and it had not even begun. I should tell you what the lantern wing is, so you understand what was at stake, because a number with zeros is the schemer's way of seeing it, and I want you to see it the other way. It is not the grandest part of Warden Hall. The state rooms are grander, and the gatehouse is older, and the great hall draws the crowds. The lantern wing is the part the crowds walk past. But the east colonnade is where the masons of 6 centuries left their signatures. Not their names. Masons did not sign their names, but their hands. You can stand under the Wren Capitol and see, if you know to look, where one carver's chisel ran a hair too deep on a feather, and how the man beside him corrected for it on the next stone. 2 craftsmen in conversation across a joint, dead these 400 years, and still talking to anyone patient enough to listen. The oriel was glazed by people who would never see the inside of the room it lit. Maintained but never diminished is not a slogan about stone. It is a promise made by the living to the dead and the unborn both, that the work of hands will not be sold for a frontage. I had kept the book of that promise for 19 years, and I had never, until that gray week, been asked to defend it. I found I did not know whether I could. What I did know was the timetable, and the timetable frightened me. I had typed it myself. The shoring went up over the weekend, the soft strip of the colonnade, the stripping of fittings, and the careful removal of the salvage units, which is to say the theft of the capitals, was scheduled for the start of the next week. And the heavy demolition, the breaker, the 200 tons into the skip line, was set for the Tuesday following. 11 days. In 11 days, the east colonnade of the lantern wing would be a photograph in my book, and a line of dressed stone in a reclamation yard's catalog, and the only honest answer to a future clerk's question: what was done here? And why would be a lie I had let pass over my own desk? I watched the soft strip begin on the Monday, and I learned something about the difference between a clerk and a sentry. I stood at my office window and made notes: the registration of the salvage van, the time the first fitting came off, the foreman's name, the supervisor who signed for the load. I made a beautiful record of a crime in progress. That is what a clerk does. He documents. But a record, I was beginning to understand, is a thing that proves a wrong after the wrong is finished. It is evidence for the inquiry that sits over the grave. Brennick at his arch was doing the other thing, the thing I had spent 19 years never learning to do. He was not documenting the loss. He was standing between the loss and the men who came to take it, and he was doing it not with his fists or his rifle or his voice, but with the plain, immovable fact of his post and the law that put him there. A clerk asks later, why did no one stop this? A sentry is the answer to that question in advance in the present tense. So I resolved to stop being only a clerk. I tried to slow it the only way a clerk can, with paper. On the Monday, I sent Vec a memorandum requesting the structural survey that any genuine stabilization would generate, beam by beam. The engineer's report that says this wall is failing. This is the danger. Every honest repair starts there. If the East Range was truly decaying, the survey existed and I had a right to it. I asked for it formally, in writing, with a copy to the file, because a copy to the file is a thing that cannot be unsaid. Vec's reply came within the hour, and it was charming and it was empty. The survey, he wrote, was with the consultants and would be circulated in due course. In due course. I had been a clerk too long not to know that in due course meant after the wall is down and the question is moot. He added a line at the end, gentle as a hand on the shoulder, that I should leave the technical judgments to the surveyor's office and concentrate on the schedule. Which was Vec, courteously, telling me to mind my counting and stop reading the orders I was made to sign. So I read them harder. I went back through 11 weeks of work orders for the East Range, and I built in my own hand the thing they had not given me, a true record. And the true record told the story the forms were hiding. There was no engineer's survey, none, anywhere in the chain, only an unsigned condition note referring vaguely to advanced deterioration consistent with the building's age. There was a skip contract sized for the removal of 200 tons of masonry, which is not the weight of a repair, it is the weight of a wall. There was a haulage booking to a reclamation yard for salvage materials, dressed stone, carved units. They had a line item for the capitals. The hart, the wolf, the wren, priced and booked for sale before a chisel had touched them. And there was one more thing, the thing that turned the cold in my stomach to something harder. A draft conveyance, mislaid in a bundle of utility invoices, describing the cleared eastern parcel and its onward grant to a development vehicle whose directors I did not recognize, except for one. The company secretary was a woman named in the same week's honors list as Pell Caro's sister-in-law. I sat with that page a long time, a robbery dressed as a repair, and now I had its map. But a clerk with a map is still only a clerk, and the wall was already in its cage of steel. Tuesday they would begin to take the colonnade down. I knew because I had typed the schedule. That evening, in the long blue light before the gates closed, I did a thing I had never done in 19 years. I went to the lantern arch and I spoke to the sentry as a man speaks to another man. "Trooper Brennick," I said, "I need you to hear me and I know you cannot answer." He did not answer. He did not need to. He was listening with the whole still length of him, the way only a man who has spent his life being silent can listen. "On Tuesday the surveyor's contractors will come to take down the east colonnade," I said. "They will tell you it is stabilization. It is not. I have the orders. There is no survey, there is a skip for 200 tons, and the capitals are already booked to a reclamation yard. The wing is protected by the deed of preservation, maintained but never diminished, and they have taken the plaques off the wall so that no one will remember." When the contractors come, they will need to pass under this arch with their machines because the service road runs through it. There is no other way to bring the heavy plant to the colonnade. I paused. The thing I was about to ask a man to do could end his service. I am going to fight this with paper upward as fast as I can. But paper is slow and the wall is fast. If the machines pass, the colonnade is gone before any committee sits. I am asking you, I have no right to ask you to make them slow. For the length of 3 breaths he said nothing, and I thought I had insulted a good soldier with a coward's plan. Then Brennick said, without moving, in that wind-quiet voice, "I don't need to be asked, sir." A pause. "The service road through this arch is a controlled way. Heavy plant moves through it on a movement order signed by the duty officer against the works permit. That's standing instruction, older than the contract." Another pause, and for the first time in 3 winters I saw the ghost of something cross his face, not anger, not even satisfaction. Resolve. If the movement order doesn't match a lawful permit, nothing passes this arch. Not a barrow. That's not breaking protocol, sir. That is the protocol. They've been counting on no one keeping it. I had come to ask a guard to bend the rules. He had just told me the rules, kept exactly, were the trap the schemers had walked into without seeing it. "Get me the permit they're relying on," he said. "The real one with the real authority on it. I'll hold the arch on the law. You hold the law on the paper. Between us, we may buy the building a week. A week is enough for a man with a true record to be heard." I went home that night and did not feel like a coward for the first time in 11 weeks. Tuesday came gray and cold, with a low sky the color of the lead on the roofs. The contractors arrived at 7:30, and they had brought the heavy plant, a low loader carrying an excavator with a breaker arm, the kind of jaw that turns 600 years of stone into rubble in an afternoon. The foreman was a decent enough man named Tace, who had no idea he was a thief's instrument. He had a job and a schedule and a family like all of us. He drove up to the lantern arch in the gray light, with the low loader behind him and the breaker on its back, and he found a sentry standing in the center of the controlled way. Brennick was not blocking it with his body. That would have been a small, breakable thing, and they would have called the constables and had him moved, and it would have been over by 9. He was standing at his post, where the standing instruction placed him, in the correct attitude, his rifle at the slope, and he was doing nothing at all except being the lawful sentry of a controlled way. That is a different thing entirely. To move him, they would have to show the law that put him there was wrong, and the law was not wrong. Tace climbed down with his clipboard. "Movement order," he said, not unkindly. "Plant for the East Range. We're cleared." "Show me the order and the permit it answers to," said Brennick. Tace handed across a sheet. I was there. I had made sure to be there, with my true record in a folder under my arm and my heart going like a hammer. I watched Brennick read it with the unhurried care of a man who has all the time in the world because he is not the one in a hurry. He read it twice. "This is a movement order signed by the duty officer," he said. "It cites a works permit number and date. The standing instruction for this way says heavy plant moves only against a lawful permit, so I'll need to see the permit." He held the sheet out, not returning it, simply holding it in the air between them. Not the number of it, the permit. For works on a structure under a deed of preservation, a lawful permit carries the consent that the deed requires. Bring me that consent and the plant moves. Until then, this way is closed to it. That is the standing instruction. I did not write it and I cannot waive it. Tace stared at him. "Mate, I just drive the lorry." "I know," said Brennick, and there was no unkindness in it either. "I'm not stopping you. I'm stopping the absence of a permit. Bring the permit." There was, of course, no permit, because there was no consent, because the deed of preservation had never been honored. That was the whole of the crime. They had built a tower of forms with nothing under it, and a single still man at a single arch had asked, courteously, to see the foundation, and the tower had nothing to stand on. Vec arrived within the hour, and Vec was not courteous now. He came across the yard fast, his coat flapping, two of his clerks trailing him, and he went straight at Brennick the way men go at an obstacle they expect to flinch. "Trooper, you are interfering with approved palace works. Stand aside. The movement order is signed. You answer to the duty officer, and the duty officer has signed." "I answer to the standing instruction, sir," said Brennick, eyes forward, perfectly level. "The instruction requires a lawful permit for heavy plan on a protected structure. I've asked for it. It hasn't come. When it comes, the plant moves." "It is a stabilization," Vex said, and his voice rose. "The wall is dangerous." "Then there's an engineer's survey that says so," said Brennick. "And the survey is the easiest thing in the world to bring to this arch. Bring it, sir. Bring the survey and the consent. I'm not asking you to stop the work. I'm asking you to prove it's lawful, which an honest work is glad to do." I have replayed that hour 100 times, and what strikes me still is that Brennick never once raised his voice, never once moved his feet, never once did the thing Vex so plainly wanted him to do, which was to become an angry man who could be reported and removed. He stayed exactly what he was, a disciplined sentry asking, with terrible politeness, to see the paper that should have existed. And every minute he asked, the absence of that paper grew louder in the gray yard, until it was the only sound any of us could hear. That was when Vex made his mistake. He turned to me. "Clerk," he said, "you hold the works file. Tell this man the permit exists. Confirm it and we proceed." The yard went still. Tace and his men, Vex's 2 clerks, the foremans made up on the low loader, all of them looking at me, the clerk of works of the lantern wing, the man whose signature ran through the whole chain, the man who had been minding his counting for 19 years. I will not pretend I was brave the way Brennick was brave. He had decided who he was a long time before that morning. I was deciding it right then in the cold, with my true record sweating in my hands. But I had built the record for a reason, and a clerk's whole purpose, the one duty that outranks the counting, is to keep the truth of the building. "I cannot confirm it," I said. My voice did not sound like mine. "There is no permit, Master Vex, because there is no consent. There is no engineer's survey. There is a skip contract for 200 tons and a haulage booking that names the carved capitals as salvage and a draft conveyance of the cleared parcel to a development company. I have it here. I have all of it here." I held up the folder. "The trooper is correct. This is not a stabilization. The standing instruction is the only thing in this yard that has been followed properly, and I will not put my name to a lie to break it." I have never seen a man's face do what Vex's face did. It is one thing to be defied by a soldier. Soldiers are obstacles, and obstacles can be gone around. It is another to be exposed by your own clerk in your own yard, holding your own paper trail in his hands. "You'll lose your post," he said very quietly. "Probably," I said, "but the wing won't lose its colonnade today, and that is the better trade." I turned to Tace. "Take the plan out, please. There's no lawful order to bring it in." And Tace, who only drove the lorry, looked at the sentry and looked at the clerk, and looked at the surveyor with his flapping coat and his rising voice and his missing permit. And Tace, being a decent man, climbed back into his cab and took the breaker out of the king's house the way it had come. Vex did not give up there. Men like Vex have one more lever always, and his was the chain of command. If he could not move the sentry, he would move the sentry's master. He went within the hour to the duty officer of the watch, a young captain named Wraith, new to the house, anxious to be seen as decisive, and he told him that one of his troopers was obstructing approved palace works and bringing the watch into disrepute, and he asked, in the reasonable voice of a senior official addressing a junior officer, that the trooper be ordered to stand aside. I learned what happened next from the watch sergeant later, and I have treasured it ever since. Captain Wraith, wishing to be decisive, came down to the lantern arch and ordered Brennick to permit the plant to pass. And Brennick, who had refused a surveyor and would, I think, have refused a king on this one point, did not refuse his own officer. He did something far harder. He obeyed the part of the order that was lawful and held the part that was not. "Sir," he said, "I'll stand aside the instant you confirm the lawful permit and the consent under the deed. The standing instruction binds you and me both. If you order me to pass heavy plan onto a protected structure without that consent, I'll need the order in writing with your name on it, so the record is clear about who waived the protection of the king's house and on whose word." A pause. "I don't think you want to be that name, sir. I don't think you've been shown what I've been shown." Young Wraith, to his lasting credit, did not insist. He was anxious to be decisive, but he was not a fool, and a man does not put his name in writing to a thing he has not seen. He asked instead the only intelligent question available to him. He asked to see what his trooper had seen. Brennick directed him to me. I gave the captain the folder. And Captain Wraith read the skip contract and the salvage haulage and the line item for the carved units, and the color went out of his face, and he did the thing that saved the colonnade as surely as Brennick's stillness had. He picked up the work's hold himself, on the watch's own authority, pending confirmation of consent, and he sent a runner not to Vec and not to Caro, but straight up, over both their heads, to the steward of the household. The watch, it turned out, had its own line to the top, and no portfolio ran along it. So the chain of command, which Vec had reached for as a weapon, closed around him instead. The sentry held the law, the officer held the sentry, the steward held the house. Each man, doing exactly his own narrow duty and not 1 inch more, became a link, and the links became a wall the breaker could not pass. The colonnade stood. The wren in its cage of steel stood. We had bought the building a day. A day, it turned out, was enough, because a day was all it took for the thing to travel beyond the yard. I did not sleep again that night, but it was a different sleeplessness. I spent it making copies. The skip contract, the haulage booking with its line for the carved units, the draft conveyance, the 11 weeks of orders with their missing survey at the heart of them like a hole in a tooth. I copied all of it twice, and I wrote a clean covering note in the plain language of a clerk who keeps the truth of a building. I did not send it to Vec. I did not send it to Caro. I sent it, first thing, by hand, to the one office in the house that sits above the controller and the surveyor both and answers to no portfolio. The steward of the household, the king's own officer for the fabric and the honor of the place. And I sent a copy to the Inspectorate of Protected Structures, the outside body whose whole existence is the deed of preservation and its kind, because I had learned, that gray Tuesday, what Brennick had known for 3 winters. The schemers had counted on the house keeping its quarrels inside its own walls. The way to stop a robbery dressed as a repair is to take it out of the house, into the daylight, where the missing permit cannot hide in a bundle of utility invoices. The steward's office moved faster than I had dared hope. By that same afternoon, a hold was placed on all works to the East Range, pending review of authority, which is the gentle language a great house uses when it has just realized something is badly wrong and does not yet wish to say so aloud. By the next morning, the inspectorate had a man at the colonnade with a clipboard of his own, and his clipboard asked the same question Brennick had asked, only now it could not be charmed away. Where, the inspectorate asked, is the consent under the deed? There was none. There had never been any. And once that single absence was admitted, the rest came apart the way a wall comes apart when you pull the keystone. The condition note had been written by no engineer. It was unsigned because no engineer would sign it. The 200-ton skip and the salvage haulage had no innocent explanation. You do not book the sale of a building's carved stone before you have established that the building may lawfully be touched. And the draft conveyance, the one I had found mislaid among the invoices, the cleared parcel granted onward to a development vehicle whose company secretary shared a name with the honors list. That document did the work that no clerk's accusation could have done. It showed the destination. It showed who was meant to grow richer when the East Range came down. A robbery is hard to prove from the act alone. It is easy to prove when you can show the hand already held out to receive the stolen thing. I was called before the steward's review, and I will confess I went into that paneled room more frightened than I had been in the yard. A clerk does not stand before the king's own officer for the fabric. He sends forms that go into rooms he never enters. But the steward turned out to be an old, dry, exact man with a stonemason's hands and a habit of long silences, and he asked me only one question that mattered. He asked why, having sensed the wrong as early as I had not raised it sooner. It was the question I had been asking myself in the small hours, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. "Because I told myself I had misread it, sir," I said. "Because raising it was difficult, and reading it wrongly was easy, and a great many small, easy choices is how a thing like this gets all the way to the breaker without one honest man saying stop. The sentry at the arch did not have that luxury. His duty is in the present tense. Mine, I had let become a thing I did after the fact in a book for a reader who would come too late. I am ashamed of the delay. I am not ashamed of the folder." The old man looked at me for a long moment with those exact eyes. "No," he said at last, "you should not be." And he said nothing else about the delay then or ever, and I understood that I had been forgiven the thing I most needed forgiving, which was the 11 weeks I had spent telling myself things. Caro tried, of course, the things that men like Caro try. He spoke of decay and danger and difficult decisions. He suggested I was a disgruntled clerk who had misunderstood routine documents. He produced, suddenly, an engineer, a tired, embarrassed man who would say only that the wall could be made to last with proper maintenance, which is the exact opposite of the danger they had needed it to be in. He argued that the conveyance was a draft only, that no parcel had been sold, that nothing had in fact been stolen. And there, at last, the review caught him, because the law of the house and the law of the land both know that you do not have to finish a robbery to have committed one. The breaker at the arch, the capitals booked as salvage, the hand of his own kin held out to receive the cleared ground, were the attempt entire, and an attempt foiled is not an innocence restored. The smiling exhaustion never quite left Caro's face, but the smiling did, and one morning his office was empty, and his name was off the portfolio, and there was, for a long while, no controller of the estates at all. What followed him out of the house was not my affair, and I did not inquire. It is enough to say that the Inspectorate of Protected Structures is not a body that forgets a wing it nearly lost, and that the daylight I had let into the matter did not go out again when the yard was quiet. Vec I felt sorrier for than I expected. He was not the architect of it. He was the instrument, a careful man who had let himself be steered into signing a lie because the man above him was charming and the alternative was difficult. The steward's review found that he had failed in his duty to insist on the consent, and the survey failed. The finding said, in the first obligation of a surveyor of the fabric, which is to serve the building and not the portfolio. He kept his pension and lost his office, and he never once, to the end, would look me in the eye in the yard. I do not think he was wicked. I think he had simply forgotten, somewhere in 11 weeks of charming memoranda, that maintained but never diminished was a duty and not a slogan. A great many small surrenders make one large robbery. I knew, because I had nearly made them all myself. The plaques came back from the conservation studio, which had never asked for them and had no record of them, and were refixed to the east colonnade where they had hung for 200 years. I was there when they went back up. The bronze said what it had always said, in letters most people never read, that the wing might be maintained but never diminished by order in perpetuity. I had typed those words onto a dozen forms without feeling them. I felt them now. I made the masons refix the plaques with the old screws, the original ones, recovered from the studio's bin where someone had thrown them, because a thing that is restored should be restored truthfully, down to the screws. And through all of it, the hold, the inspection, the review, the slow unwinding of the scheme, Trooper Brennick stood the lantern arch. That is the part I most want you to understand, because it is the part that does not photograph well, and so is the part most easily missed. He had not stopped a wall with a heroic act. He had not fought anyone. He had not, in any moment of that gray week, done a single thing he was not entirely entitled and indeed required to do. He had simply stood his post and kept the standing instruction with a completeness that no one above him had expected, and in keeping it, he had forced the absence at the center of the lie out into the open, where an honest house could not ignore it. The breaker never crossed his arch. The colonnade never fell. And he did it all, every hour of it, eyes forward, rifle at the slope, in the perfect stillness that the careless mistake for emptiness and the wise come to understand is the hardest discipline there is. The inquiry, when it came, was thorough and quiet, in the way of a great house that does not enjoy washing its linen but will not leave a stain in the cloth. The deed of preservation was reaffirmed and lodged this time where no committee could mislay it. A copy went to the inspectorate, a copy to the steward's strong room, and a third, at my request, and I was proud of the request, into my own book, written out in full in my own hand on the page for that year, so that the next clerk of works would find the promise before he ever found a work order that broke it. The salvage haulage was canceled. The capitals never left their wall. The reclamation yard, who had booked them in good faith, were courteous about it, and asked only that someone explain why dressed stone 600 years old had been offered to them as though it were rubble from a yard, and no one could give them an answer that was not shameful, so no one tried. The East Range was surveyed properly at last, by a real engineer beam by beam, and the verdict was the one the schemers had most feared. The range was sound. It needed what it had always needed, the leak in the gutter mended, a dozen stones repointed, the patient, unglamorous maintenance that keeps a thing alive without diminishing it by an ounce. The honest repair, when finally it came, fit in 2 vans and a fortnight. The robbery had needed a low loader and a breaker, and a lie 11 weeks in the building. That, in the end, is the difference between them, and any clerk of works could have told you, and only a sentry made me believe it. I did not lose my post. I had expected to, and had made my peace with it, but the steward's office took a different view of a clerk who keeps the truth of the building even when it costs him, and I was confirmed in my position with a quiet word that I valued more than any honor. I still count slates. I still chase the leak in the south gutter, but I read the orders now, all of them, and when one does not add up to a repair, I no longer tell myself I have misread it. Brennick was moved in the course of time to another arch. The watch rotates its men, and a sentry does not stand one post forever. There was no medal for what he did, because there is no medal for standing still, and that is right. A medal would have made it a deed, and it was not a deed, it was a duty. But the watch knows. The story travels along that quiet line that runs over the heads of every portfolio, the way the best stories in a great house always do, and a young trooper coming new to the lantern arch will be told, by an older one, that the man who held this arch once held a whole building, and that he did it without raising his hand or his voice, by the simple, terrible expedient of refusing to pretend the law was something other than the law. I think of him whenever I pass under the arch. He is not there now, another man is just as still, but I think of what he taught a clerk who had spent 19 years believing that keeping the truth meant writing it down. It does not. Keeping the truth means standing in front of the thing that would take it, on the day it comes to take it, and not moving. The repair that was a robbery was stopped by a man who never moved at all, and I have come to understand late that not moving was the bravest thing I ever saw done.